Basically, we are talking about is the potential for a third world war. Even if conflict was contained to East Asia, the impact on global supply chains would be immeasurable, disrupting integrated supply chains in multiple industries. Eventually, this would cause a massive sell-off in the financial markets and a refugee crisis, which would put Syria to shame.
The DPRK has been flexing its muscle and showing force with repetitive missile strikes. But what would be the impact on the global markets if this developed into an open conflict?
Well, guys, let's not sugarcoat the situation. The impact of an open conflict in Korea on the global economy would be catastrophic. Compared with the First Korean War, a second conflict on the Korean Peninsula would be much broader in scale. First, most of Asia was still rebuilding from World War II, and the global economy in the 1950s was nowhere near as integrated as it is today. I'll give you an example. Fast forward to 2011, where the floods in Thailand basically shut down the world's leading hard drive suppliers. Now imagine an open conflict which would directly involve 15 of the world's top 20 economies. For example, 6 of the world's 10 busiest ports are within the conflict zone. In addition, you would have China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan involved, and also the US and its allies, as well as Russia. Basically, we are talking about is the potential for a third world war. Even if conflict was contained to East Asia, the impact on global supply chains would be immeasurable, disrupting integrated supply chains in multiple industries. Eventually, this would cause a massive sell-off in the financial markets and a refugee crisis, which would put Syria to shame. What has been of note is that the global financial markets have largely remained oblivious to the risk, at least up to this point. While the Nikkei 225 has underperformed the Kospi and the S&P 500 year to date, this is more due to other issues. And the VIX, well, the VIX has remained in a stupor for most of the year. However, there are some exceptions, and a portion of Bitcoin's rise can be directly attributed to a flight to safety or a perceived flight to safety. You can also look at the Credit Suisse Fear Barometer and even our in-house AI-enabled risk index, and they all appear to be sensitive to what is happening in North Korea right now.
So how did we get to this current status, and can it be reversed?
Well, we should remember that the Korean War never officially ended, and we have been living under a cautious ceasefire for more than 60 years. Looking back, North Korea's missile program dates to the 1970s, but is really after the fall of the Soviet Union that Kim Jong-il accelerated development. During that time, the country was getting technical assistance from Pakistan and China, something which observers believe has continued to this day. With the ascension of Kim Jong-un, the need to focus on the program has increased. This is largely driven by the fall of dictatorships in Iraq and Libya, where the leaders basically ended their nuclear ambitions. As such, many believe that Kim Jong-un has put so much emphasis on the program to make sure that the country is viewed as a nuclear power, thus reducing the risk of regime change driven by external force. To forward this ambition, Kim Jong-un has pursued a policy known as Byung-jin, which not only includes the country's nuclear program, but also economic development, at least for the top 1%, as some comrades are more equal than others. Given this, it is highly unlikely that North Korea's nuclear program can be reversed or put on hold as long as Kim Jong-un remains in power. In fact, some security analysts in China now believe the strategic imperative is not to slow the program, but to rather professionalize it. That is to make sure that the chain of command is robust enough to ensure that an accidental launch does not kick off a world war.
So what are the possible scenarios here, and how do you see them playing out?
Well, to be honest, there is little support for restarting the six-party talks. And given the combination of North Korea's defensive posture and President Trump's Twitter tantrums, it would outwardly appear that we are beyond diplomacy. However, leaders in Asia and the US are trying to find a way forward without the situation degrading into an open conflict, though it is unsure how this will play out. For starters, Chinese President Xi Jinping cannot be seen as giving in to demands from the US. An example of this is the consensus that sanctions against Chinese banks doing business with North Korea would in some way impinge on the country that is China's sovereignty. Though there are other things China could do, such as shutting down North Korea's operations in Macau, which is how they launder funds. But this won't happen without something that Xi can offer to hardliners back home, potentially a broader discussion on the South China Sea or even Taiwan. Ultimately, this underlines the predicament that China finds itself. Yes, leaders in Beijing value stability, but they also see it as their mission to right the historical wrongs committed by the West against the Chinese state. These include President Clinton's involvement in the third Taiwan Straits crisis in the 1990s and the loss of sovereignty dating back to the Opium Wars. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin finds himself as the most senior world leader and could potentially play an important role in finding a way out of the current situation. However, he will be unlikely to move without sanctions relief, a Russia-EU free trade agreement, or some concessions from NATO, or even a combination of all three. So what are the potential scenarios? Well, in no particular order, we have to consider a preemptive first strike by the US. But this would probably include the use of tactical nuclear weapons to decapitate the North Korean regime. The risk here is that China and Russia would be forced to react. Resumption of the six-party talks is also another probability or possibility. However, talking has done little to contain North Korea's ambitions. And given Kim Jong-un's policy of Byung-jin, talking is unlikely to work now. China and Russia withdrawing tacit support for North Korea is another possible scenario. And while it's likely, it could potentially make Kim Jong-un more unpredictable. A North Korean first strike or an accidental launch also need to be taken into consideration. While this would open the door for the US and its allies to launch an all-out attack, an equally possible scenario is that it would lead to a broader dialogue and a working solution, similar to what happened after the downing of KAL 007 in 1983, or to a lesser extent what happened after the downing of MH17 in 2014. We also have the unknown unknowns. One of them is a potential welcoming of North Korea to the club of nuclear powers, but working to make sure that its program is properly managed to ensure that accidents don't happen. Personally, I'm deeply concerned that some sort of incident is inevitable. And if this happens, we need to question whether the Winter Olympics will take place in South Korea next year.
Well, thank you, Greg, for speaking with me today all the way from Bangkok. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome.
And thank you at home for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Dukascopy TV for more interviews like this.